Welcome to another screencast where we'll be continuing our discussion of the immune system and its functions, and this time we'll pick up where we left off, and I think we'll discuss here the second exposure and sort of in the basis of vaccines and what's going on here with these memory helper T cells, the memory B cells, the memory cytotoxic T cells, etc. So in a series of other screencasts, we've already talked about this whole upper part of the diagram where we get this first exposure. But now I want to talk about when you come in contact with that pathogen or that antigen for the second exposure. So remember from previous screencasts, we've made these memory helper T cells, we've made these memory B cells, we've made these memory T cells. And these are memory because they are produced and they just sort of are present in the body and are not really activated. They're not dead, but they are sort of in this dormant resting state. You might even say that they are in the G0 phase of the cell cycle, right? Not actively dividing, just kind of being maintained there. So upon second exposure to the antigen, you get the same antigen coming into you again, and that is going to look at what all this does, right? It stimulates these memory helper T cells, it stimulates the memory B cells and stimulates the memory T cells here. These memory helper T cells, upon being stimulated, will then also stimulate this memory B cell and memory T cells as well. When you stimulate memory B cells, those memory B cells will differentiate into plasma cells and you start churning out antibody. When you stimulate these memory T cells, they will then become active cytotoxic T cells, and you get all the benefits and effects down here of producing antibodies either humorally or these cytotoxic T cells, right? So this second exposure is kind of a big deal. It's that you mount this like overwhelming response here. And so the classic example here, we'll just look at the effects of the memory B cells here. So what we're doing is that we are plotting here antibody concentration against the time here. And so what we see is that at this point in time right here, this is the first exposure to antigen A. And so there's this lag time when you're exposed, and then a few days later, less than a week later, your B cells, your plasma cells, have been stimulated and you start to churn out antibodies, right? And so you get antibodies to this first antigen here, and your antibody levels go up. But then over time, those antibody levels will drop back down. But in the meantime, remember, this is antibodies, not the memory B cells. But what you've also done is that in this time right here, you have made lots of memory B cells. And so now what you have is the second exposure to antigen A at this time, right? So about a month later, let's say you come in contact with that antigen again, and that's probably pretty likely, right? I mean, you're living and circulating in the same environments with the same people, at school, at home, maybe at rehearsal or practice sessions, right? So that you're exposed to it a second time is probably not really surprising to you. But upon second exposure, what happens is those memory B cells are triggered and the memory helper T cells are triggered, and you get a massive, here, very steep increase in a very short period of time, right? So this short period of time, you end up getting, so this is 10 to the 1, this is like almost 10 to the 4, so you're almost getting a 4-time increase here in the volume, right, the concentration rather, of those antibodies, right? And it happens over a much shorter period of time, and so then you get this much quicker rate here, right? And then over time, the antibody level will drop down, but it does not drop all the way back down to 0 where it was before, right? And you get this tailing off here, and eventually that's going to sort of continue over that way. But on the second exposure, you get a massive increase of these antibodies here. Right? And let's say then a little bit later, you get exposure to the first exposure to antigen B. This is a different antigen, right? And again, you get this little lag time right here. And this is now making more memory B cells but that are specific for antigen B, and you start churning out antibodies to B there. And again, the same pattern is going to occur there. So upon secondary immune response here, you get an elevated and a level of antibodies that then remain elevated. And again, those antibodies are doing things like binding to the pathogen, binding to the antigen, preventing any sort of infection there. Okay, so this is the basis for vaccines, and the basis for being vaccinated is that at some point here you are exposed to an attenuated, so in a vaccine. And the POGO activity does a good job of describing here that Jenner and his discovery of these vaccines. Right, so you get an attenuated virus. This means that it is not the full virus or the bacteria, but just a piece or a part of it, enough to then stimulate an immune response, right? And so now that initial infection, if you will, that initial vaccination has increased your antibody levels, but then they drop back down. But again, remember, the big thing here is that you've made these memory B cells and these memory helper T cells as well. And so now on second exposure to that, you get this massive production of antibodies then, and this prevents you from getting sick. Right? So initially you may get sick from this. You may feel symptomatic in this time right here, but then those symptoms go away, right? So less than a week. But then on second exposure, look, you're not even really symptomatic at all. You don't even really experience any symptoms of that, and you get this immune response that's then protecting you from that virus. Right? Classically a virus. There are bacterial ones as well, but viruses are the other big deal there. So HIV infection follows that predictable course here, so I think we'll deal with this later in class, but you can take a look at that graph and sort of interpret that as well. Okay, so that was second exposure stuff down there. We'll deal with allergies in a separate one as well. So again, being able to describe here and explain the second exposure and the basis for vaccines was the goal there. Thanks for listening. Bring your questions to class.